I was walking through the city late last night, well after midnight. It was quiet, almost empty. Suddenly a car backfired, a loud, sharp crack that echoed off the buildings. About 20 feet ahead of me, this guy in a business suit, just walking normally, he instantly dropped into a crouch. He flinched hard, spun around, hands half raised, eyes wide. For just a second, he looked less like a person on a sidewalk and more like, well, like a cornered animal. A moment later, he realized what it was. Stood up, straightened his jacket, maybe a little embarrassed, and kept walking. But that image, it stuck with me. That instantaneous primal reaction, a jolt of pure predator-level fear, hardwired into his body, triggered by a totally harmless sound. It was a quick survival instinct for a world that doesn't really exist anymore. Not like that. It just got me wondering, if that ancient fear switch is still so close to the surface, what other primitive wiring is still running our lives? What ancient deep-seated instincts were we desperately trying to manage with our modern minds? And what happens when that old wiring and our new world just don't match up?
That tension you described, that really is the central conflict, isn't it, of the human condition. We're walking around with this incredibly sophisticated, self-aware brain. It lets us manage complex systems, think abstractly. But underneath it all, well, there's this neurological architecture. And it's optimized for instant survival responses. For a high-threat, small-scale world, the brain defaults to patterns that kept us alive 10,000 years ago, maybe longer. And now we're trying to filter all this 21st century complexity through those ancient biases.
Okay, right. Let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive today into the research that tries to map out this ancient wiring. Our mission basically is to investigate exactly how these deep-seated cognitive biases still drive such pervasive beliefs in supernatural agents. Things like God, ghosts, a sense of life, purpose. We need to figure out how these beliefs were maybe instrumental in solving huge societal problems back then. And then, crucially, what happens now when these primitive agent-driven interpretations clash, sometimes dramatically, with modern evidence-based systems, especially when you look at global mental health interventions. So let's start right at the source, the cognitive hardware. The research we've looked at makes a really strong claim here. It's saying supernatural belief isn't just, culture inventing stories out of thin air. It's consistently rooted in a specific, measurable suite of cognitive biases. These biases are like foundational instincts.
That is the crucial finding. The models they used, they rigorously tested the direction of the relationship. Which way does the arrow point? And they found that these supernatural beliefs, they seem to spring from reliably developing cognitive tendencies that come from our existing mental architecture. The research establishes pretty clearly that the cognitive biases predict a belief, not the other way around. They actually tested, for instance, the idea that maybe engaging in religious practice makes you more dualistic, but the empirical support just wasn't there. The mechanism seems to run from the cognitive default, the wiring basically, to accepting the belief system.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So that immediately suggests we're kind of predisposed to believing things that might contradict objective reality, simply because our brains find those interpretations easier or maybe more useful somehow. And the cornerstone of that structure, based on what we read, seems to be mentalizing or a theory of mind.
Mentalizing, yeah. It's often called the human superpower. It's our ability to represent, understand, and even predict others' minds, their intentions, their beliefs. It's what allows for really complex social cooperation. And the research models, they identified this ability as the critical starting point. Because individual differences in how well we do this, how well we mentalize, seem to launch the next and arguably most potent bias. Mind-body dualism.
Oh, right. The ghost in the machine. We often think of dualism as coming from philosophers like Descartes, right? He formalized that separation of the non-physical mind and the physical body. But you're saying the research suggests this separation isn't just a philosophical invention. It's more like an innate, hardwired intuition.
Precisely. The brain's architecture itself seems to naturally process the physical world objects, body's motion, and the mental world thoughts, intentions, desires, using distinct neural circuits. This just makes it intuitive, almost easy for us to separate the mind and body, to think they're subject to different rules. Think about a young child, for example. They instinctively get that a toy car can break, physically break, but its thoughts are memories. Those can't break in the same way. The body decays, right? But consciousness feels like it could be immortal.
But is this bias truly universal? Or is it heavily influenced by, say, Western culture, where Descartes was so prominent?
Well, it really appears to be a human default. The empirical support is pretty overwhelming on this. Studies have confirmed this dualistic thinking, not just in Western populations, but across incredibly diverse cultures. You find it in North America, sure, but also in rural populations in Madagascar and Fiji. even historically in ancient Chinese texts. The intuition that a non-physical self can exist separate from the physical shell, that seems to be globally the default position for the human mind.
Okay, and once you make that distinction, that the mind can exist outside the body, independent of physical decay, well, the path to supernatural belief seems wide open then, doesn't it? You've basically established the plausibility of an immortal soul or spirits or consciousness surviving death.
That's the key psychological leap, exactly. The path model confirms it. Individual differences in mentalizing encourage mind-body dualism. And this dualism is a very strong predictor. It leads directly to belief in God, generalized paranormal phenomena, and also the belief that life has some ultimate purpose. It's really the foundational mechanism that makes something like an afterlife even conceivable.
So once we have this idea of a separate soul, the next question our brain seems to automatically ask is, okay, why are we here? Which brings us neatly to the second mechanism, teleological thinking, the purpose instinct.
Right, teleology. It's the tendency to assume that things in the world exist because they were made for a purpose. The hypothesis is that this is a kind of byproduct of artifact cognition, which is our natural, very powerful capacity to recognize tools and understand they were designed by an agent with a specific goal. We are tool makers, fundamentally, so our brain is highly efficient at seeing intentionality in design.
So we're so good at designing hammers for hitting nails or, I don't know, cups for holding water,
Right.
that we just extend that design logic to the entire universe, even when there's no obvious designer.
We extend it promiscuously, as the research puts it. That's the term they use. The default setting is kind of, if it exists, it has a purpose. Children are classic examples. They're often called intuitive theists because they might believe, for instance, that mountains were created specifically for climbing, or that clouds are there for the express purpose of raining. It's their job. When you extend this instinct to complex natural phenomena, it easily becomes an assumption that some intelligent agent must have designed the world for our use or for some purpose.
It feels like that instinct would be hugely powerful in driving religious belief, seeing purpose everywhere.
It is powerful, yeah. Although, interestingly, the study found it was actually the weakest of the biases tested in predicting supernatural belief, at least relative to dualism and the next bias we'll talk about. Still, it remains a significant predictor. Belief in God, paranormal events, and that feeling that life itself has a purpose. Even among people who identify as secular, you often find this residual sense that there must be some sort of, transcendental intentionality behind human life, which suggests that teleological framework is really deeply entrenched.
Okay, on to our third mechanism then, anthropomorphism. This is seeing agents everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Projecting human-like mental states onto non-human things, like yelling at your car when it won't start, or seeing faces in the clouds, that kind of thing.
Exactly, and this bias is directly linked to the evolutionary logic of agency detection. The brain seems to operate based on asymmetric costs. Just imagine you're an early human walking through tall savanna grass. The cost of falsely detecting an agent, maybe seeing a potential predator where there's only wind rustling the grass, that cost is pretty small. You waste a little energy, maybe crouch down or run away unnecessarily. Annoying, but you survive. But the cost of failing to detect a hidden agent, a real predator, or maybe a rival human hiding there, that cost is catastrophic. It's a type 2 error, a miss, that could easily lead to death.
Okay. So evolution favored the brain that was highly sensitive, maybe even hypersensitive, to agency, leading us to project intention onto anything ambiguous just in case.
Absolutely. The brain is optimized for safety, fundamentally, not for objective accuracy in these situations. This hyperdetection of agency leads us to anthropomorphize all sorts of things, from natural forces like thunder, thinking it's an angry god, to potential supernatural entities like spirits in the woods.
Okay, but here's where the findings get a bit nuanced, even challenging. Anthropomorphism, the research said, was related to general paranormal belief, things like ghosts, UFOs, ESP, that sort of stuff. But it was unrelated to codified general religious belief, like belief in God within a major religion. And even more surprisingly, cultural exposure to institutionalized religion, like Christianity in the study, actually seemed to work against this bias. Why that distinction?
Yeah, that's a subtle but really crucial insight into how culture kind of manages these primitive intuitions. Anthropomorphism seems to foster more diffuse, maybe animistic, uncodified spiritual beliefs. Seeing a specific stream or tree as having a spirit, or believing in miscellaneous things like UFOs. These are independent, localized agents. Institutionalized religions, particularly the ones focused on singular, morally concerned deities, the big gods we'll get to, they work to standardize the supernatural landscape. They codify the agents you should believe in. One god, maybe specific angels, a defined devil.
So they centralize the supernatural, in a way, corral it.
Precisely. High cultural exposure to an established religion, it was, Christianity, in this specific study, was negatively related to general anthropomorphism because the institution effectively tells you where the intention lies and who the important agent is. It sort of suppresses the tendency to just project human minds onto random, non-sanctioned objects or phenomena. So the primitive wiring provides the raw material, the potential for belief, but culture then steps in to standardize and constrain it. Shape it.
Okay, so we've got the raw cognitive material, we separate mind from body, we see purpose everywhere, and we're hyper-alert agent detectors. These individual biases alone don't quite explain the explosive spread and stabilization of global religions, especially those centered on powerful singular deities, the big gods, as the research calls them. For that, we apparently have to look at two massive social problems: death and cooperation.
Right. We're shifting gears now, moving more from individual psychology to cultural group selection. The moment humans achieved this really sophisticated self-awareness, the ability to think about the past, present, future, they gained an unparalleled adaptive advantage, obviously. But they also created a unique psychological terror, the recognition of their own inevitable mortality, death. Our basic instincts tell us to run from threats, right? Fight or flight. But you can't run from death itself. It requires a psychological adaptation, not just a physical one.
And this is the foundation of terror management theory, or TMT, isn't it? The idea that realizing we're going to die motivates us to seek some form of permanence, something lasting.
Absolutely. TMT posits that we manage this potentially paralyzing terror by, well, fabricating and participating in highly complex cultural worldviews. These are sophisticated belief systems that can be political, national, or religious that grant order, meaning, and significance to our existence. And if you adhere to the values and rules of this system, the idea is you achieve some form of symbolic permanence, immortality, in a sense.
Right, and the sources outline two main forms of permanence that these cultural systems offer.
Yes. The first is what you might call non-supernatural or secular immortality. This involves leaving a lasting legacy, publishing academic papers that outlive you, passing down a family business, maybe leaving a powerful political legacy, something like that. The second form, and arguably the most potent offering of organized religion, is supernatural immortality. The promise of eternal, literal existence, whether that's heaven in Christianity, Jannah al-Nam in Islam, or achieving moksha and transcending the cycle of death and rebirth in Hinduism.
And the research provides some pretty stunning confirmation of this terror management function using something called mortality salience. How exactly do those studies work? They sound intense.
They are quite direct. The standard protocol involves inducing mortality salience, or MS participants, are typically split into groups. One group is asked to write, often in detail, about what they think will physically happen to them as they die, and the emotions that thought brings up. Grim stuff. The control group is usually asked to write about something painful but non-lethal, like an upcoming dental visit or maybe test anxiety. And then researchers measure their subsequent behavior or attitudes.
Okay, so what kinds of behaviors get amplified after people are forced to think about their own death?
They absolutely cling harder to their worldview. It's quite consistent. MS increases faith in the afterlife for believers. It increases individual support for their co-religionist people who share their beliefs. And it often heightens hostility toward those who hold competing worldviews. For instance, one study found that when Christians were reminded of death, they showed increased monetary support for fellow Christians, but, crucially, no corresponding increase in support for Jewish people. It bolsters the in-group. And importantly, MS also increases explicit belief in supernatural agents. Belief that God or Allah exists, is powerful, and actively intervenes in the world. TMT basically argues we double down on our meaning systems when our existence feels threatened.
Okay, that explains the powerful psychological drive. But now, what about the social drive? We're great cooperators, humans are. But as societies got larger, way beyond small kin-based groups, things like kin selection and simple reciprocal altruism just couldn't scale up, right? And you can't really rely on direct reciprocity when you're trading with strangers you might never see again. You face that massive free rider problem. how do you stop people from cheating the system?
Exactly. This is the big historical puzzle. How do you maintain social order, fairness, and trust in a dense population of basically anonymous people? The argument from cultural group selection is that it favored the emergence and spread of pro-social religions, meaning religions center around big gods. These deities are not indifferent, distant forces. They are powerful, they are morally concerned, they are often believed to be omniscient, all-knowing. Most importantly, they monitor human behavior and deliver swift rewards or punishments, either in this life or more often in the next.
Ah, the powerful cosmic enforcer, the one who sees everything, even when the local police or chief isn't watching, making sure you don't cheat the person you just traded grain with.
Precisely that. And quantitative anthropological reviews show a really striking correlation between societal scale and the structure of belief. Belief in a moralizing, monitoring God increases dramatically with the complexity and size of the society. In the smallest hunter-gatherer type communities, the prevalence of belief in such a God might only be around 8%, but this jumps way up to around 60% in large, centralized states. The rise of the big God seems to map almost perfectly onto the rise of complex, anonymous, large-scale cooperation.
And does the data confirm that this system of supernatural monitoring is actually effective in regulating behavior? Does it work?
It seems to, yes. Belief in morally concerned, punitive supernatural monitors, think hell, divine judgment, or just an omniscient God-watching has been shown experimentally to increase pro-social behavior. Things like fairness and cooperation in anonymous economic games improve. It's also associated with reduced cheating in lab settings and, on a larger scale, demonstrably lower national crime rates, even when controlling for other factors. The idea of these big gods acts like an externalized but also internalized justice system.
This also sheds some light on why religious groups often require such high costs from their members. Strange rituals, dietary restrictions, things that seem really demanding or unnecessary from the outside.
Exactly. Those costly commitments are thought to be essential for group stability and longevity. They're not just written rules. There's fascinating research comparing 19th century religious and secular communes in the U.S. The religious groups were found to outlast the secular ones by an average factor of 4 over a 120-year span. And, crucially, the religious communes imposed more than twice as many restrictions on their members' costly commitments like dietary taboos, mandated celibacy, specific fasting rituals, or limiting communication with the outside world.
So these rules weren't just arbitrary, they served a crucial function for keeping the group together.
They seem to have reduced the free rider problem significantly. If you're willing to fast or follow strict dietary laws or give up certain things, you're sending a very strong signal of loyalty. It demonstrates your commitment is high, it's non-negotiable. This kind of high-cost signaling increases internal trust and makes defecting from the group much more costly, socially and psychologically. It weeds out the less committed.
Okay, and finally, let's loop back quickly to dualism and the body. These cultural worldviews also have to manage the awkward fact that we are animals, our creatureliness, as the sources put it. The reality that we age, we excrete, we get sick, we decay.
Yes, that dualistic instinct we talked about, it gets heavily reinforced by the need to manage the shame and terror associated with our physical animal nature. Reminders of our creaturely aspects, things like vulnerability to disease, basic physical functions like peeing or pooping, or just the inevitability of decay studies show these reminders significantly increase death anxiety. And this anxiety, in turn, motivates believers to try and distance the immortal soul from the mortal body. That's likely why you see practices across many religions, like fasting, mandated celibacy, ritual ablutions, or washing, even self-flagellation in some extreme cases. They can all be interpreted as symbolic attempts to overcome, purify, or somehow distance the immortal self from the messy, base and...
All right, this brings us directly to the friction point today. While these ancient beliefs might have helped build societies and manage existential terror back then, their persistence today can create direct, sometimes painful conflict with modern evidence-based systems. And this becomes starkly visible when our intuitive, agent-detecting wiring encounters serious mental distress or illness.
Exactly. We call this phenomenon cultural pathoplasticity. A bit of jargon, but it just means the specific content of a severe mental illness. What a person hears or believes or experiences during psychosis, for example, is often shaped by the religious and cultural context they live in. The raw experience might be psychosis, a neurological event, but the interpretive framework is provided by the culture. And delusions with explicit religious themes or figures, God, Jesus, the devil, demons, jinn, black magic, these are reported in anywhere from 20% to, in some studies, up to 60% of psychosis cases globally. It's very common.
So the cognitive bias to see agents and assign purpose, it kind of gets hijacked or recruited and then distorted by the experience of serious mental distress, creating a personalized supernatural narrative to explain the chaos.
And this seems particularly true in cases of what are called delusions of possession. These are defined as the distorted perception that one's own mental processes, actions, or even internal sensations are being controlled by external supernatural powers. This interpretation is directly facilitated by that innate dualistic framework we discussed. If the mind is separate from the body, well, then it makes intuitive sense that an external agent, a demon, a spirit, whatever, could theoretically step in and take over the mind or body.
What kind of internal experiences often get interpreted as possession in these cases?
Often, these delusions are accompanied by really complex and disturbing symptoms, like synesthetic hallucinations. These are strange, often deeply unsettling bodily sensations, feelings like your internal organs are twisting or something is crawling under your skin, or just extreme visceral discomfort that has no obvious physical cause. Now, for a mind that's already primed by dualism and hyperagency detection, the most intuitive explanation for these uncontrollable alien sensations is often that some kind of spiritual entity is invading or manipulating the body and mind from the inside.
Wow. The sources provide this incredibly complex patient experience, Alice, that really illustrates the profound ethical and practical challenge this poses for clinicians trying to help. Can you tell us more about her case?
Yes, Alice's case is quite striking. She was a young woman seeking help after experiencing severe psychosis. Initially, she was terrified. She was hearing the voices of demons who were tormenting her constantly. After engaging in a specific religious ritual, she reported feeling a profound shift. She believed the demons had been expelled, but that a singular, powerful entity who she identified as Lucifer had entered and remained.
So she essentially just traded one terrifying agent for another. That doesn't sound like progress.
Well, what's staggering is the evolution of her relationship with this perceived agent. Over time, her mind, still operating with that primitive wiring, searching for order and purpose, began to anthropomorphize this voice. While it was initially distressing, she gradually began to find the voice of Lucifer, she called it, comforting, even reassuring at times. She actually reframed the entity. She started calling him the angel of balance, and she came to believe that this entity, bizarrely, helped her control her own aggressive impulses. Her interpretation shifted completely from being a passive victim of invasion to having a kind of controlling, powerful ally inside her.
That is a fundamental functional shift.
Wow. So instead of treating the voice purely as a symptom to be extinguished, she somehow incorporated it into her coping mechanism.
Exactly. When asked about it later, she explicitly stated, "If I cannot get rid of him, I need to collaborate with him." It was a conscious decision. Her dualistic framework, coupled with her innate drive toward finding purpose and agency, essentially used this powerful supernatural agent, Lucifer, in her interpretation, to make sense of and try to manage her uncontrollable internal chaos. The primitive mechanism provided a language, a narrative for her suffering, and even offered an attempt at emotional and behavioral regulation, however unconventional.
Yeah, that complexity really underscores why this clash between ancient wiring and modern medicine becomes such a serious public health crisis, especially in developing nations where traditional belief systems are still extremely dominant. Oh, the problem of intervention is immense in places like Nigeria, as the source material clearly demonstrates. When mental illness is widely interpreted through these traditional lenses, specifically linked to witchcraft, which had something like a 93% belief prevalence in one survey, or seen as punishment for sins, 73% prevalence, or just general supernatural causes, around 67%, then the treatment-seeking behavior is automatically diverted away from evidence-based medical or psychological care.
Right, because if the default assumption is spiritual attack, then the first line of defense is always going to be spiritual, not medical or psychiatric.
Absolutely. The research confirms this pattern. Approximately 80% of Nigerians experiencing significant mental health problems initially seek help from informal providers, traditional healers, churches, prayer camps, imams. Furthermore, nearly 70% of diagnosed schizophrenia patients in Lagos were found to have first sought therapy through these same spiritual or traditional healers. This often results in significant delays, sometimes years, even decades, in accessing crucial psychological and psychiatric interventions. And these delays often lead to much worse long-term prognosis.
So the clinical challenge isn't just about diagnosis, then. It's about navigating this profound cultural impedance mismatch. Clinicians can't just dismiss the possession narrative as just a delusion without completely alienating the patient and their family.
Right. The recommended clinical strategy has to be one of negotiation, really. Clinicians are explicitly encouraged to first explore the meaning the patient and family ascribe to these possession symptoms. What does it mean to them? Instead of attacking the belief directly, the approach is more about acknowledging the cultural framework respecting the patient's reality while gently seeking ways to introduce alternative explanatory models. Models that can hopefully coexist with evidence-based treatment. For example, maybe framing medication not as something that fights a demon directly, but perhaps as something that stabilizes the body or mind so the spiritual battle can be better fought, or so the person can better engage with spiritual support. The primitive wiring has provided a language for suffering, a way to make sense of it. And modern medicine, to be effective globally, has to learn to speak or at least understand that language to improve efficacy and acceptance. #outro.
So this deep dive has really shown how much our current reality, the way we experience the world, is fundamentally shaped by wiring that was optimized for solving yesterday's problems. From that hardwired cognitive hardware, the dualism, the teleology, the hyper-agency detection to its function in solving huge problems like the existential fear of mortality and structuring human cooperation through the invention of powerful big gods, these ancient patterns seem inescapable.
Yeah, and the overwhelming weight of the research really does suggest a pretty fixed psychological direction. It flows from these intuitive cognitive biases to belief, not the other way around. These hardwired tendencies, while they were clearly invaluable for survival in the past and for forging large-scale societies, they continue to shape our interpretation of reality today, sometimes providing comfort, purpose, meaning, but other times, as we saw with mental health, creating a really challenging interpretive framework that can actively conflict with modern scientific understanding and interventions.
So our modern world, even with all its laws, science, and secular institutions, is constantly being filtered through that resilient, ancient, cognitive wiring. It's always there.
And that resilience is quite profound. While strong secular societies and effective rule of law often seem to supplant the need for big gods, replacing supernatural monitoring with courts, police, contracts, etc., that secular security can apparently be quite fragile. We've seen clear evidence of reversals of secularization, pretty dramatic spikes in religiosity, and reliance on supernatural explanations in previously secularized populations right after massive, incomprehensible natural disasters. It really suggests that when external order collapses and chaos seems to reign, that primitive, deep-seated need to project purpose and agency onto random events is always lurking just beneath the surface, ready to step in and provide some kind of meaning behind the mess.